As you can hear, the song touches on two sides of human life. So in summary, when the songwriter was young, the clouds were beautiful to her. They looked like rows and flows of angels' hair and like ice cream castle in the air. However, as the years passed, her perspective of the clouds changed. Clouds block the sun. They rain and snow on everyone, and they get in the way. So as the years passed, the songwriter discovered that things that were ordinarily lovable had a less lovable side. So developing on this idea, the songwriter turned to talk about a similar contrast in love and in life. So let us now turn to chapter 11 and 12 of the book of Daniel. After we have read this chapter, we will realize that it is just like Joni Mitchell. God's people have over the course of history also had experiences, something which can be perceived from both sides. Chapter 10 of the books of Daniel touches on an angel's messages being sent to Daniel. And chapter 11 and chapter 12, it records the content of the message that the angels have brought over. Chapter 11 is like a movie trailer. It is a sneak preview of things to come. And chapter 11 actually sketches the events in Palestine and the surrounding nations during the periods from the 6th century BC to the 2nd century BC. The angels, like an artist, he has painted two ways of looking at human history. Let's turn to consider the scripture. Chapter 11, if we look at the first 20 verses of chapter 11, the angels revealed the transfer of the world power from Persia to Greece. Alexander the Great, the Greek who defeated the Persian, he has died relatively soon after defeated Persia. And we understand from the ancient history that there are 4 leading generals later carved up Alexander's kingdom. If we turn to chapter 11, verse 5 to 20, this particular pericope, the angel's message focused on the kingdom established by 2 of the Alexander's generals, the king of the north and the king of the south. This can be found in verse 5 and verse 6. They fought over controlling Jerusalem, which lay between them. So we may get a flavor of the conflict during that time from the following verses. Let's turn to verse 7. But when one of her relatives became king of the south, he will raise an army and enter the fortress of the king of the north and defeat him. Verse 11, then in a rage, the king of the south will rally against the vast forces assembled by the king of the north and will defeat them. Verse 13, a few years later, the king of the north will return with a fully equipped army far greater than before. Brothers and sisters, from these verses, we see violence, we see war in the regions. Some may think that this sort of violence and war is the distant past. But the very truth is that violence and war features consistently throughout both ancient history and modern history. So indeed, there are parts of the world today that are at this moment experiencing violence and the threat of war. So in a world filled with violence and war, many may begin to question, where is God? If he is a good God, why isn't he doing anything to put an end to all these things? We may become burdened with doubts about God. But the problem is, war and violence are not the only problems in the world. Let's continue to consider further verses in these chapters. In verse 21, the next to come to power will be a despicable man who is not in line for royal succession. He will sleep in when least expected and take over the kingdom by flattery and intrigue. Verse 32, he will flatter and win over those who have violated the covenant. But the people who knows their God will be strong and will resist him. Verse 34, during these persecutions, little help will arrive, and many who join them will not be sincere. These verses imply demonstrate the ambitions and the unscrupulousness of men. We see, for example, people conspiring or spreading falsehood. My dear brothers and sisters, beyond violence and war, we know that we are also surrounded by all sorts of hypocrisies and falsehood in the world today. And these circumstances may make us doubt whether God is really watching over the world or whether God is really with us. To make matters worse, we see that those who are really loyal to God also suffer unjust persecutions. Some are even put to the sword. Let's look at verse 31 to 33. It tells us that his army will take over the temple fortress, pollute the sanctuary, put a stop to the daily sacrifice, and set up the sacrilegious objects that causes desecrations. He will flatter and win over those who have violated the covenant, but the people who knows their God will be strong and will resist him. Wise leader will give instructions to many, but these teachers will die by fire and sword, or they will be jailed and robbed. These verses show us that the wicked people did evil at will. Those who were really loyal to God, they died by fire, they died by sword, or were jailed and were robbed. This is a very sad and cruel reality. Is this world still the Father's world? God does not seem to be intervening. We seem to be living in a world that has spiraled out of control. Notwithstanding the bleakness of chapter 11, let's keep in mind the importance of seeing both sides. As I say, clouds have both sides, and so does history. So in verse 27 onwards, the angel's message shows us another side to the history. So the following verse helps us to see the other sides of human history. We look at verse 27. Seeking nothing but each other's harm, these kings will plot against each other at the conference table, attempting to deceive each other, but it will make no difference, for the end will come at the appointed time. Verse 29. Then at the appointed time, he will once again invade the south, but this time the result will be different. In verse 35, and some of the wise will fall victims to persecution. In this way, they will be refined and cleansed and made pure until the time of the end, for the appointed time is still to come. Brothers and sisters, you will notice that three words are repeated throughout these verses. The appointed time. The angel's message tells us that although some individuals, some groups, they may appear to be all-powerful, but they do not have control over time. The turning point referred to as the appointed time remains firmly within God's hand. We also see from chapter 11 that evil and darkness, they will come to an end one day. This is described as follows in verse 44 and verse 45. Let's take a look. But then news from the east and the north will alarm him, and he will set up in great anger to destroy and obliterate many. He will stop between the glorious holy mountains and the sea and will pitch his royal tents. But while he is there, his time will suddenly run out, and no one will help him. Brothers and sisters, history bears testament to this. No matter how many people were killed by the seemingly all-powerful Adolf Hitler back in the day, the power of evil eventually came to an end. No matter how many people were killed by Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong, the power of darkness was overcome at some point in time. Dear brothers and sisters, it is true that the world looks to be spiraling out of control. But God has not disappeared at all. No matter how rampant evil may be, let us remember that the power of darkness is not eternal. For God, He has fixed an appointed time. God will eventually remove the power of evil, and evil will come to an end. As we sing in the hymns, "This is my Father's world." We are so familiar with these songs. The lyrics say that though the wrong seems off so strong, God is the ruler yet. And so our hearts need not be sad. The angel's message does not end in chapter 11. The angels continue his message in chapter 12, and it tells us that there will be an unprecedented time of anguish one day. Let us read chapter 12, verse 1 to 3. At that time, Michael, the archangel who stand guard over your nations, will arise. Then there will be a time of anguish greater than any since nation first came into existence. But at that time, every one of you, your people whose name is written in the book, will be rescued. Many of those whose bodies lie dead and buried will raise up, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting disgrace. Those who are wise will shine as bright as the sky, and those who lead many to righteousness will shine like the stars forever. So we can summarize the flow in this way. In chapter 11, we saw instances of sufferings and tribulations. This is similar to the experience of a pregnant woman going into labor. As if I got experience. Before she gave birth, she experienced intermittent labor pain, and the pain comes and goes. The peak of the pain experienced by God's people and found in chapter 12. So in chapter 12, verse 1, the angel says that when the time of anguish comes, those who belong to God will be rescued. Who is it who will rescue God's people? Chapter 12 says, Archangel Michael will stand guard over the people of God. As for the people of God whose body lie dead and buried, they will raise up and shine like the stars forever. These are the glories. These are the rewards given by God. My question is this future glory worth waiting for? And the Apostle Paul has in fact directly addressed these questions in Romans chapter 8, verse 18. Paul says, he said, "Yet what we suffer now is nothing compared to the glory he will reveal to us later." Paul's earthly suffering could not compare at all to the future glory from God. My dear brothers and sisters, you are God's people. When the time of anguish is upon us one day, even if God allow us to face suffering, even God allow us to face the threat of death, may we never despair, for God has given us his assurance. He has assured us that in the final hour, every one of the people of God whose name is written in the book will be rescued. For those who die before the final time of anguish, the angel says, those whose bodies lie dead and buried will raise up, receiving everlasting life. So in chapter 12, the angels didn't reveal any details about the event that will take place during the time of anguish. There's no revelation on that. We don't know what will happen in details. But this is because the focal point is not there. The focus point is God's salvation. The focal point is the gift of everlasting life, not an attempt to predict what will happen in the future. That is not the focal point. So in Daniel chapter 11 and chapter 12, we see two sides of human history. The angelic message urges us not to be naive. We must face the harsh reality of life on earth. Tragedy, fear, sorrow, these are part and parcels of life. We need to prepare to face all this. On the other hand, we must also learn to see God is in full control. The angelic prophecies reveal God's sovereignty over world history. World history unfolds as part of God's plan. Human history, it moves towards God's predetermined goals. The oppressors on earth can only exercise their cruel power for a short time. God is still in control. The power of darkness is not eternal, for God has set an end to the time his people has to suffer. There is a time frame. Salvation, resurrections, glories, these are waiting for the people of God who remain faithful to the end. Daniel 11 and 12 have revealed two ways of viewing human history. And history repeats itself until the time of anguish. How could we respond and how could we prepare for such a reality? Firstly, we need to be watchful. The angel tells Daniel in verse 4, he says, but you, Daniel, keep this prophecy a secret, seal up the book until the time of the end, where many will rush here and there, and knowledge will increase. Got wear mask or not? Sorry, I didn't wear mask. In other words, the prophecy will one day be unveiled entirely in God's time. The content of the prophecy were not fully comprehensible to Daniel. Daniel don't understand everything. And then Daniel was told to keep them safe, keep them properly, so that for future generations of God's people to read. And during the end times, many will go back and forth and search anxiously through the sealed scroll. And knowledge of God's purpose as revealed by his prophet during an end time will greatly increase. Brothers and sisters, we are now living in the end time. As mentioned by the Apostle Paul, it's not I say, Apostle Paul in the 1 Corinthians chapter 10 said we are living in the end time. Jesus also said the same thing. The prophecy is particularly meant for us as we live in the end time. Therefore, we need to be watchful. When I recently heard about MOH announcement on the expansion of the safe management measure in Singapore, something immediately came to my mind. This was the idea of the mark of the beast. Today, we need to show the mark of vaccinations before we are allowed to enter shopping malls, before we are allowed to enter into the attractions and the eateries. Even when more travel lanes open up, we need to show the mark of vaccination in order to travel. In some countries, people face multiple restrictions and even the prospect of losing their job if they are not able to display a vaccinated mark. This phenomenon is very similar to the end time description in the book of Revelations, where no one can buy, no one can sell unless he has the mark of the beast. Brothers and sisters, please do not misunderstand my point. I am not saying that the mark of vaccination is the mark of the beast. I say again, I'm not saying that the mark of the vaccination is the mark of the beast. No, I'm not saying that. My point is that we have seen firsthand how a simple mark can overnight become a fundamental requirement in order for us to continue living our life in the way we are used to. Therefore, the more important question is, as we are living in end times, are we being sufficiently watchful? Or we are sleeping? Are we prepared for the day when we are unable to lead our lives properly unless we have the mark of the beast on us? Will we compromise our belief? Will we accept the mark of the beast and compromise our belief? Brothers and sisters, the angel's prophecies in chapter 12, verse 4 is meant for us today, living in the end time. We need to be watchful. Even as we yearn for the glorious day, yearn for the promises ahead, we need to be watchful and prepare for the time of anguish. Besides watchfulness, we are reminded to stay positive during tough time. Let's continue reading chapter 12, verse 10. Verse 10 says, "Many will be purified, cleansed, and refined by these trials, but the wicked will continue in their wickedness, and none of them will understand. Only those who are wise will know what it means." The angels classified mankind into those who are wise and those who are wicked. Although suffering is unpleasant and nobody welcomes trials, but a wise person discerns the value of trials. Instead of a bitter and complaining spirit, it is wiser to keep ourselves positive in times of trial and to seek purifications of our heart, to seek purification of our soul. We will eventually receive our inheritance in God's time. So, be watchful, be positive, and thirdly, be faithful. The angels in verse 13 told Daniel, "Go your way until the end. You will rest. And then at the end of the days, you will rise again to receive the inheritance set aside for you." Before explaining this verse, let's switch to the New Testament for a while, and we will get right back in verse 13 shortly. Okay, in the New Testament, the Gospel of John. Remember Jesus once, when he's resurrected, and he appeared to his disciple after his resurrection, and Jesus told Peter, "I tell you the truth. When you were young, you went wherever you wanted to go. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and others will dress you and take you where you don't want to go." I'm sure you remember this verse. Jesus said that this was to let Peter know the way in which Peter could die and bring glory to God. However, Peter turned around and he saw the other disciple. And then he asked Jesus, "What about him, Lord?" What does Jesus reply? He said, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you?" What is that to you? Then Jesus told Peter, "As for you, you just follow me now." So in other words, Jesus wanted Peter to stay focused. Jesus wanted Peter to follow him faithfully, regardless how difficult the journey may be. Regardless, you know the where your peer goes. You don't care about others. Just focus. Just follow Jesus faithfully. Brothers and sisters, this is almost the same as the ending of the book of Daniel. Daniel was confused at times. Daniel failed to understand certain things. The prophecy he don't know entirely, then certain things he don't understand. But God's message to Daniel was, it is okay. You don't have to know everything. Just shoot it out and move on. You just stay focused and follow me faithfully to the end. This is what God told Daniel. So I like the Good News Bible translation, especially translate the verse 13. He says that, "And you, Daniel, be faithful to the end, then you will die, but you will rise to receive your reward at the end of time." Today's believers are tempted to compromise the values. We are tempted to worship that which is not God. If we take a step back and read the entire book of Daniel, it is a call to God's people of every age to live out our faith in a hostile world, whatever the cost. Just like Daniel and his friends. I turn now to my conclusion. The English OD both sides now tell us that everything has two sides. The song starts off talking about clouds having two sides, before turning to talks about a similar duality in love and in life. Unfortunately, the songs end with the phrase. The songs, how does it end? He said, "I really don't know life at all." This is how it ends the songs. But brothers and sisters, this is not the case for the book of Daniel. The last two chapters of Daniel review the two sides of human history. On one hand, the world appears to be in the hand of evil and uncertainty. On the other hand, God remains firmly in control, as I quoted from the hymns earlier. This is my Father's world. Let me never forget that though the wrong seems off so strong, God is the ruler yet. So these two sides of human history has been spiraling towards the time of anguish. But in the end, believers will arise to everlasting life and shine like the stars forever. We know the ending. As we await the coming of this day, may we learn to be watchful, learn to be positive and be faithful to the end, especially during time of tribulations.